Well, I want to dive right in here on Iran and what we saw happen over the weekend. A really shocking display of Iran attacking Israel overtly, something I don't think we've really ever seen before. What was your reaction to all of this?
I was surprised. I didn't think they would go to this level. Certainly, Israel and Iran have been in a Cold War in the past, and Iran has used proxies against Israel in the past. But this is the first time the Islamic Republic has attacked Israel directly from its territory. It's the first attack by a state actor on Israel's territory since 1991 when Saddam Hussein fired Scud missiles at Israel. And it's a major escalation in the sense that if you think back in 2020, end of 2020, beginning of 2021, um, we were all looking at President Trump, and we were wondering to see how the Iranians would react because in 2020 Trump killed Qasem Soleimani. Actually, he killed Soleimani at the beginning of 2020, actually right before COVID started. And so throughout that whole year, we're kind of looking to see how the Iranians would respond. And their response was they used some of their proxies to attack U.S. military bases in Iraq, which was kind of what we expected. This was a much more disproportionate response to looking at the Iranian hierarchy. Israel killed somebody who's not nearly of the same significance as Soleimani. So the idea that you're hearing retailed in a lot of the media that this is sort of just a response or retaliation on Iran's case, no, that's not accurate. It's an escalation. It seems like their strategic calculus is that after October 7th, Israel had been weakened, and maybe Israel's vaunted technical superiority was not as high as they thought. Iran also considers itself to be a peer competitor to Israel in terms of its use of artificial intelligence and unmanned, security devices. Iran is, I think, ninth in the world in terms of giving out PhDs in the AI field. So they think of themselves as somebody who can compete with the Israelis on that. And so I think they were really pulling out all the stops, and they were really trying to show that they could hurt Israel in a significant way. And that was a serious attack, multi-layered, very similar to some of the mixes of weapons we've seen fired from the Russians at Ukraine, because of course Iran now is an arms dealer to the Russians as well. And so I was shocked by the initial response. I was gratified to see how successful Israel and the coalition was in stopping the attack, and I think that's a positive thing. And getting ahead of I think where we want to go with some of this, I would not say that we should allow that to lull us into a false sense of security, but it is gratifying to know that actually Israel is as technically competent as we thought. Their missile defense is as good as we thought. And when the chips are down, even some of those who have criticized Israel very publicly for actions in Gaza are still willing to support Israel when it's directly attacked by Iran.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned a couple of things there I would love to just highlight. One of them being, this assumption that Iran might have that Israel is somehow weakened. One area where Israel has been weakened has been in the public standing, the way the media has framed it, right? So you have a situation where a lot of world leaders are coming against Israel now and saying things against Israel, where I would imagine a country like Iran is looking at that, as are other terror groups, and they're saying, maybe this is an opportunity or a time for us, because people are turned against them. Now, obviously, to your point, what you just said, the coalition, even those that criticized Israel, coming forward and stepping up to the plate. But I have to ask more broadly, when we look at the Biden administration, and in particular, President Joe Biden, the way that this has sort of been handled, even before the attack, he offered a one-word response: don't.
Yeah.
And that was very interesting to hear. Obviously, Iran did not listen to that. What do you think is going on there? Do you think anything that the Biden administration is doing would deter a further attack?
So I'll say two things about Biden. One is sort of a strategic thing, and then the other is sort of positional in the region. The positional thing in the region is that throughout his career, Biden has been pretty good on Israel in the sense of, he's always understood the importance of defending Israel. There even in Prime Minister Netanyahu's own memoir, he talks about a conversation he had with Biden, where Biden said, I'm the best friend you have inside the inside the Obama administration. He might actually also be the best friend that Israel has inside the Biden administration. That's a different question. But so he understands that he's willing to defend Israel. Where he's been bad consistently for a long time is on Iran. He's been one of the major advocates of this idea that the U.S. can have a more constructive relationship with Iran. I recently found again an article that I remember actually reading several years ago from September 2001 in the New Republic after 9/11, where Biden is saying, "Oh, we need to cozy up to the Iranians. They're Shia, the Al Qaeda terrorists are Sunni, and so we should just give them a bunch of money." Literally, something he said in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in September of 2001. So his instincts on Iran have been bad for a long time. You combine that with Biden seems to have this policy mix. And we've seen this now with Ukraine. We've seen this now with Israel, where he is willing to defend allies and he's willing to take steps to defend allies, but he wants to constantly push for de-escalation. In other words, he's constantly trying to de-escalate. He's trying to get things to calm down. He's trying to convince his allies not to take actions that would actually lead them to win the war or decisively defeat their opponents, because he's afraid what the other side will do to escalate. Now, if you know anything about international relations theory, and I know it's kind of obscure for a lot of people, one of the core concepts of that is deterrence. And Matt Kroenig, who's a very, I would say, well-respected national security scholar, defines deterrence as you're trying to prevent other people from doing bad things by holding the threat of escalation in reserve. In other words, deterrence works because you threaten other countries that if they do certain things, you are willing to escalate. And what Joe Biden has showed is that he is constantly trying to de-escalate. And that is the opposite of deterrence. And this is why his deterrence isn't working. Because deterrence only works if there's a credible threat that if somebody does something that you don't want them to do, that there's going to be a severe negative consequence. And whether it's the pullout from Afghanistan, whether it's his in the run-up to the war in Ukraine, the minor incursion comments, whether it's this don't doctrine, I guess, that he's been trying with Iran, he does not understand deterrence. And this is concerning because this is not someone who's new to foreign policy. Joe Biden has been involved in major foreign policy issues for over 40 years. And if he doesn't understand there's probably not going to be a point at which he gets it.
Well, and he's not deterring. I mean, he didn't deter, right? Nothing he said deterred. I mean, in fact, the biggest attack we've seen, as you were saying, in quite a long time, it happened after he said don't. So don't was not an effective measure for him. Sorry to interrupt you, but I just
you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
And so when deterrence fails, I would, people don't like this analogy, but I would analogize it to if you're a parent and you tell your kids not to do something and they do that thing, your deterrence in preventing them from taking whatever bad action they were going to take has failed. So then what you're doing is you're punishing them, and that punishment establishes future deterrence, right? Because they now know this is the consequence. Okay. And so not only has Biden failed in deterrence, but by telling the Israelis, no, we don't, I don't do anything to respond, just take the win and move on, which is what is being reported that he has said, he's actually trying to prevent future deterrence, because you failed at deterrence this time. So if you're going to try to prevent them from doing it again, there have to be consequences, because then you have clearly established that this is unacceptable. You've crossed a line. And if you do it again, there are going to be severe consequences. If you don't impose consequences now, basically what you're doing is you're giving them a green light to do this again. And yes, the damage to Israel in this particular attack wasn't as great. Ironically, this Muslim country that's saying they're going to wipe out the Jewish state, the only casualty from it was a Muslim girl, who's the only person who was injured in this attack. But the cost of it is very high, and there's nothing that says that future attacks won't do some damage and won't cause civilian casualties. And so the best way to actually prevent this from happening again is to let the Israelis respond in a decisive, strategic manner where they take some action to impose consequences in Iran at a time and place of their choosing.
Yeah, and so let's talk more about that, because it is interesting that you would allegedly see President Joe Biden saying, no, don't respond. I mean, it would seem America always respond. We tend to respond. If somebody does something militarily, we are going to respond. So the idea that we would tell them not to, obviously it goes back to the de-escalation, trying to not allow anything to escalate. But what do you think that looks like? I mean, you said at a time of their choosing, so you do think Israel should strike back, and you think they should do it in a way that would prevent this from happening again, correct? Just to reiterate that and what that might look like in your view.
Yes. So, first of all, this is unfortunately not the first time where Israel's been attacked and the U.S. has prevented them from responding. In 1991, when Saddam fired those Scud missiles at Israel, President Bush, was able to successfully pressure then Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir not to respond. Now, the reason for that was we were involved in the run-up to the Gulf War. Saddam fired the Scuds at Israel as a way of trying to break the U.S. coalition and cause dissension in that coalition. And so Bush knew that he was planning on pushing Iraq out of Kuwait. And so, he got the Israelis to step back from that. The problem, of course, with that is the Israelis remember that, and that didn't necessarily work out all that well for them because it's not like they received any brownie points or got anything from that. So Biden if he's trying to prevent the Israelis from responding, that's a historical memory that they have. They remember the last time they stepped aside for the United States. There was no benefit to them from that. Second, overwhelmingly, Israeli public opinion is going to support a response. So why would Benjamin Netanyahu put his own governing coalition at risk in order to appease Joe Biden, who's doing this, let's be honest, for re-election reasons, when Joe Biden and his party are basically, attacking Netanyahu? So that makes no sense. And third, it's the right thing to do strategically. Now, I don't think Israel has to respond immediately. I think they can. I think they have the flexibility to do that. But what you want to think about in terms of deterrence is you want to think about what is going to have the maximum impact. What is the thing that you can do that has the maximum negative impact on Iran at the lowest cost to you, the lowest cost to Israel? In other words, you don't want to sacrifice reputational effects. You don't want to sacrifice other priorities. Israel does still have this fight in the south, in Gaza. Israel has a threat from the north. And so you want to have something that's going to have the most impact, that's going to deter Iran from doing this again, that is going to, at the same time, have the least costs to Israel in other ways. And so there's a number of options they could pursue. They could strike at Iran's ability to make these drones or missiles. They could strike, any number of calibrated cyber attacks. They could do something that's deniable, or they could do something that's public. They have a lot of options. And I think that's part of the reason why we might not see something immediately, because the Israelis are going to want to make sure that they're calibrating it correctly. And they actually do have a lot of ways they could potentially strike Iran. First of all, they probably want Iran to be a little bit concerned about which direction it's going to come from. They don't want to signal it. They're going to want to keep it close. When Israel strikes, it will be without warning. It will be in a way that Iran is not prepared for and does not expect, and it will be decisive. It may also be deniable. In other words, it wouldn't surprise me if it's something that Israel does where they can credibly say, well, we're not going to necessarily claim that, but everybody kind of, behind the scenes knows they did it as sort of a safe face-saving measure there. So I think that something like that is probably what we're going to see. And I would say it might not happen as quickly as people think. It might not happen, this week or even in the next month, but I believe it will happen. And there will be a very clear evidence that Israel has responded in a way to try to deter future attacks.
And after October 7th and this latest antic by Iran, that makes sense that would be the case. I appreciate you coming on today, joining us and breaking it all down. Looking forward to talking with you again sometime soon.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.